Sarah Martinez set down the bottle of cleaning solution on the cold marble floor, her hands trembling as she opened the pink envelope from her uniform pocket. Tuition increase notice. The bold letters stabbed at her chest like a knife. $2,000 a month. The amount equaled 3 times her cleaning salary, equaled all her hope for Emma to attend the special school for children with disabilities. Sarah looked up at the sprawling penthouse with its floor-to-ceiling windows, where a brown-haired child sat quietly building towering structures from colorful Lego bricks. 4 years of working as a cleaning lady had taught her to become invisible in the world of the wealthy. But today, as the late Chicago afternoon sun streamed through the glass and illuminated those bright plastic pieces, Sarah felt something different was about to happen. Something that could change everything, or destroy what little she had left. The Morrison penthouse occupied the 42nd floor of a gleaming tower on North Michigan Avenue, its windows offering an unobstructed view of the Chicago River winding through the city's steel and glass heart. Sarah had arrived precisely at 3:30, as specified by Elite Home Services, carrying her caddy of supplies and wearing the navy uniform that marked her as someone who cleaned up after other people's lives. She'd expected another sterile apartment filled with expensive furniture that nobody actually used. What she hadn't expected was the 5-year-old boy sitting cross-legged on the Persian rug, surrounded by what must have been thousands of Lego pieces, building with the focused intensity of an architect. The child, Leo, according to her work order, didn't acknowledge her presence. His small fingers moved with remarkable precision, selecting each brick with deliberate care and adding it to a complex castle structure that rose nearly 2 feet from the floor. Sarah had seen Emma work with similar concentration, that particular stillness that came when a child's entire world narrowed to the task in front of them. She began her work quietly, starting with the kitchen's granite countertops and stainless steel appliances. The apartment felt more like a museum than a home, beautiful, cold, and somehow hollow. Family photos lined the mantelpiece above a fireplace that looked like it had never been used, showing a younger version of Leo with a woman who had his same serious dark eyes and a tall man with sharp features and an expensive suit. "You must be the new cleaning service." Sarah turned to find the man from the photograph standing in the doorway, though the expensive suit had been replaced by dark jeans and a white button-down with rolled sleeves. Daniel Morrison looked exactly like what central casting would order for a successful CEO, tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of confident posture that came from never having to ask permission for anything. But there was something in his eyes, a carefully controlled tension that Sarah recognized from her own mirror. "Yes, sir." Sarah Martinez from Elite Home Services. She wiped her hands on her apron, suddenly conscious of the contrast they made, her with her second-hand work clothes and cleaning supplies, him with his Italian leather shoes that probably cost more than she made in a month. "I wasn't expecting anyone until Thursday." They moved up the schedule, something about a last-minute opening. Sarah glanced toward Leo, who hadn't looked up from his building project. "I can come back later if it's not convenient." Daniel followed her gaze to his son, and Sarah watched his expression soften almost imperceptibly. "No, it's fine, just, please don't disturb him. Leo doesn't like being interrupted when he's building." "Of course." Sarah understood that instinct, that fierce protectiveness. She felt it every time someone stared too long at Emma or spoke to her daughter in that overly loud, overly slow voice that people used with children they thought were different. She returned to her work, moving through the apartment with practiced efficiency. The living room was pristine, as if no one actually lived there, but she noticed the small details that told the real story. The coffee ring on the side table next to the leather chair, the throw pillow positioned just so, the way certain books were worn at their edges while others looked untouched. It was while dusting the built-in shelves that she heard it, a small sound of frustration from where Leo sat working. Sarah glanced over and saw him staring at his castle with a frown, holding a red Lego brick in his palm. He'd been searching for something specific, she realized, turning pieces over in his hands with growing agitation. Without thinking, Sarah set down her dust cloth and approached slowly, the way she would with Emma when her daughter was overwhelmed. Leo didn't look up, but she could see the tension in his small shoulders, the way his hands had begun to shake slightly. The castle was impressive, a medieval structure complete with towers and battlements, built with the kind of spatial awareness that would have challenged most adults. But there was something missing from the main tower, a gap in the pattern where a connecting piece should go. Sarah knelt down a few feet away, careful not to invade his space. "That's beautiful building," she said softly. "I bet it took a long time to get all those pieces just right." Leo didn't respond, but his hands stilled. Sarah could feel him listening, even if he wouldn't look at her. "My daughter Emma loves building things too," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's always losing pieces, though, usually right when she needs them most." Sarah scanned the scattered bricks around Leo's workspace and spotted what he was looking for, a red connecting piece that had rolled under the coffee table. Sometimes they hide in the sneakiest places. She reached under the table and retrieved the red brick, holding it out in her open palm without moving any closer. Leo's eyes flicked to her hand, then to her face, then quickly away. But after a moment that stretched like an eternity, he reached out and took the piece. The transformation was immediate. Leo fitted the red brick into place, completing the connection between the castle's main tower and its eastern wall. The structure that had looked slightly off balance suddenly came together, solid and complete. For the first time since she'd arrived, Leo smiled. It was a small thing, barely more than a twitch at the corners of his mouth, but it lit up his entire face. "Leo." Sarah looked up to find Daniel standing at the edge of the living room, his expression unreadable. How long had he been watching? She scrambled to her feet, suddenly aware that she'd crossed some invisible line. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "He seemed frustrated and I just thought." "What did you do?" Daniel's voice was carefully controlled, but she could hear the accusation underneath. "Nothing, he was looking for a piece. I found it under the table." Daniel's gaze moved between Sarah and his son, taking in Leo's relaxed posture and the completed castle. "No one else has been able to do that," he said quietly, and Sarah wasn't sure if he was talking to her or to himself. "Do what?" "Get him to accept help from a stranger." Daniel ran a hand through his dark hair, disturbing its perfect styling. "Leo hasn't. He doesn't usually respond well to new people." Sarah wanted to ask why, wanted to understand the careful way Daniel watched his son, the protective tension that radiated from him whenever Leo was mentioned. But she was just the cleaning lady, and she'd already overstepped enough boundaries for one day. "I should finish up," she said instead, moving back toward her supplies. "I still have the bedrooms to do." Daniel nodded, but he didn't move. "How did you know?" he asked as she gathered her cleaning cloths. "About the piece he was looking for." Sarah paused, thinking of Emma's frustrated tears when her puzzles didn't come together right, of all the small victories and setbacks that made up their daily lives. Experience, I guess. Some kids just see patterns differently than the rest of us. Doesn't make them wrong, just specific about how things should fit together. She saw something shift in Daniel's expression, a crack in that careful control. But before he could respond, his phone buzzed with an incoming call. He glanced at the screen and his jaw tightened. "I have to take this," he said, already moving toward his home office. "Please don't, just finish your work." The dismissal stung, but Sarah was used to being dismissed. She returned to her cleaning, working through the apartment's bedrooms and bathrooms with methodical efficiency. But she found herself listening to the low murmur of Daniel's voice from his office, catching fragments of what sounded like a tense business conversation. When she finished, she packed her supplies and prepared to leave. Leo was still building, now working on what looked like a bridge connecting his castle to a smaller structure he'd started. She watched him for a moment, remembering her own childhood impulse to build bridges between sidewalk cracks, between couch cushions, between the pieces of her world that never quite seemed to fit together. As she headed toward the door, Sarah noticed something small and red on the coffee table. Another Lego piece, the same size and color as the one Leo had been searching for earlier. Without thinking, she picked it up and set it where he would be sure to see it, right next to the bridge he was building, where the morning light would catch it first thing tomorrow. The elevator doors were closing when she heard it, a small voice, clear and bright, calling out from somewhere behind the apartment's heavy door. "Thank you." Sarah pressed the button for the lobby, her heart beating faster than it should have been. In 4 years of cleaning houses for Elite Home Services, no one had ever thanked her. Not once. But somehow, in the space of a single afternoon, a 5-year-old boy who didn't talk to strangers had managed to say the 2 words she needed most to hear. As the elevator descended toward the marble lobby with its uniformed doormen and crystal chandeliers, Sarah found herself thinking not about the impossible tuition notice in her pocket, but about the small red brick she'd left behind, a piece that didn't belong to any set, but somehow fit perfectly into the space where it was needed most. 3 days later, Sarah returned to the Morrison penthouse carrying the weight of another sleepless night. Emma's teacher had called that morning about the transition to public school, how Emma would need extra support, how the change might be difficult, how they were sorry but there was nothing more they could do. The words had followed Sarah through her morning appointments, a steady drumbeat of worry that made her hands shake as she mixed cleaning solutions. But as the elevator doors opened to the 42nd floor, Sarah heard something unexpected. Laughter. High and bright, the sound of a child delighted by something wonderful. She found Leo exactly where she'd left him 3 days ago, surrounded by his Lego empire. But now he wasn't alone. Daniel sat cross-legged on the Persian rug beside his son, holding what appeared to be an instruction manual, while Leo enthusiastically pointed at various pieces scattered around them. "No, Dad, that's the wrong kind of brick," Leo was saying, his voice animated in a way that made Sarah stop in the doorway. "We need the ones with the round things on top, the studs. Those are flat pieces." Daniel looked up as Sarah entered, and she saw something she hadn't noticed before: confusion, yes, but also a desperate kind of hope. "Sarah, Leo's been asking for you." "Asking for me?" "Every day since Tuesday." Daniel's voice carried a note of wonder that made him sound younger than his 35 years. "He keeps asking when the nice lady who finds things is coming back." Leo looked up at the mention of his name, and his face broke into that same small smile Sarah remembered. But this time it was accompanied by something else: recognition, and what looked like genuine pleasure at seeing her again. "Hi, Leo," Sarah said softly, setting down her cleaning caddy. "What are you building today?" Instead of the usual silence she'd expected, Leo scrambled to his feet and tugged on her hand, pulling her toward his construction area with the enthusiasm of a child showing off a prized possession. Sarah let herself be led, acutely aware of Daniel watching their interaction with that same careful intensity. "It's a bridge," Leo announced, pointing to a half-completed structure that spanned the gap between his original castle and what looked like a small village. "But I can't make it work right. The pieces keep falling down." Sarah knelt down to examine Leo's work, her cleaning duties momentarily forgotten. The bridge was ambitious, too ambitious, really, for the foundation he'd built. The span was too long without enough support underneath, causing the middle section to sag and eventually collapse under its own weight. "That's a really smart design," she said, meaning it. "You know what the problem is. It's not the bridge that's wrong. It's just trying to be too brave all at once." Leo tilted his head, considering this. Too brave. Sometimes when we try to reach too far without building the right foundation first, things fall down, but that doesn't mean we give up. Sarah began sorting through the scattered pieces, looking for smaller connecting blocks. "Maybe we need to think about this differently. What if instead of one big bridge, we built it in sections? Little bridges that connect to make one big strong one. She showed him how to build support pillars first, creating anchor points that would hold the weight of the span. Leo watched intently, then began mimicking her technique with his own pieces. Within minutes, they had a stable foundation. "Now the fun part," Sarah said, handing him a connecting piece. "You show me where it should go." What followed was the most natural collaboration Sarah had experienced in years. Leo had an intuitive understanding of spatial relationships that amazed her. He could see how pieces would fit together 3 moves ahead, while Sarah contributed the practical knowledge of how to make unstable structures solid. Together, they built not just a bridge, but a complex network of walkways and platforms that connected Leo's entire Lego city. "You're good at this," Daniel said quietly. Sarah looked up to find him still sitting on the floor, but now his posture was relaxed, his expression unguarded. "At what?" "Understanding him. Most people," Daniel trailed off, running a hand through his hair. "Most people talk to Leo like he's broken, or they ignore him entirely. But you talk to him like he's just Leo. Because he is just Leo." The words came out more forcefully than Sarah had intended, carrying 4 years of frustration at people who saw Emma's diagnosis before they saw her daughter. "He's a smart, creative kid who happens to see the world differently than most people. That's not something that needs to be fixed." Daniel was quiet for so long that Sarah wondered if she'd overstepped again. But when he spoke, his voice was soft. His mother used to say something similar. The past tense hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken loss. Sarah wanted to ask what had happened, wanted to understand the grief that seemed to cling to both father and son like shadows. But Leo chose that moment to complete the final connection on their bridge project, and his delighted shout of "It works" drove away the momentary sadness. "Look, Dad, look how far it goes." Leo bounced on his toes, pointing at the span that now connected all the elements of his Lego world. "Sarah showed me how to make it strong." "I see that." Daniel's smile was genuine now, reaching his eyes in a way that transformed his entire face. "That's incredible, buddy. You both did amazing work." The praise warmed Sarah more than it should have. When was the last time someone had complimented her on anything other than how thoroughly she'd cleaned their baseboards? "I should let you two play," she said, reaching for her cleaning supplies. "I still have work to do." "No," the word burst out of Leo with surprising force. "Don't go yet. We haven't finished the village part." Sarah glanced at Daniel, unsure. This wasn't part of her job description, and she was already behind schedule for her next appointment. "Stay," Daniel said quietly. "Please. I'll call your supervisor and explain that we needed extra time today." "You don't have to do that." "I want to." Daniel pulled out his phone, already scrolling to find the Elite Home Services number. Leo hasn't been this engaged with anyone since. He stopped himself, but Sarah could fill in the blank, since his mother died. While Daniel made the call, Sarah and Leo continued building. She learned that he preferred red and blue pieces to any other colors, that he always built his structures from the ground up rather than starting with the roof, and that he had an encyclopedic knowledge of different Lego sets that bordered on genius. "Emma would love this," Sarah said as Leo showed her a particularly clever technique for creating curved walls. "My daughter, she's really good with puzzles and patterns too." "Is she like me?" Leo asked, and there was something in his voice, a hope so fragile it made Sarah's heart ache. "She's like you in some ways, different in others. That's what makes people interesting, don't you think? If we were all exactly the same, the world would be pretty boring." Leo nodded solemnly, as if this was a profound truth he'd been waiting his whole life to hear. "Can she come play Legos sometime?" The innocent question hit Sarah like a physical blow. The gap between Leo's penthouse world and Emma's reality, their cramped apartment in Logan Square, the constant worry about money, the looming transition to a public school that might not understand her daughter's needs. suddenly felt insurmountable. "Maybe someday," she said carefully, not wanting to make promises she couldn't keep. "I talked to your supervisor," Daniel said, returning to their spot on the floor. "Tom Hayes, he seemed pleased that we requested additional time." Sarah bet he was. Elite Home Services charged premium rates for their flexibility and discretion, which usually meant cleaning up after parties that had gone too late or dealing with clients who changed their minds about what they wanted done. "I should probably get back to the actual cleaning," she said, though the last thing she wanted was to return to scrubbing bathrooms while Leo played alone again. "Actually," Daniel said, his tone carefully casual, "I've been thinking about getting some regular help with Leo. Someone who could be here when I have to work late, maybe help with activities and social interaction." Tom mentioned that Elite sometimes provides companion services for clients who need more than just housekeeping. Sarah's pulse quickened. Companion services paid 3 times what cleaning services did, enough to make a real difference in her ability to keep Emma at the special school. But she'd also learned not to trust offers that seemed too good to be true. "What kind of companion services?" "Nothing formal, just being here, playing with Leo, helping him with projects." Daniel gestured toward the elaborate Lego cityscape they'd built together. "You're obviously good at it, and he responds to you in a way that he doesn't with most people." "Most people?" Daniel's expression darkened slightly. His previous nanny quit after 2 weeks, said he was too difficult to manage. The woman before that lasted a month but spent most of her time on her phone while Leo played alone. The casual cruelty of it made Sarah's chest tight. She thought of all the people who had written off Emma as too slow or too different over the years, and felt a familiar surge of protective anger. "I'd be interested," she said carefully, "but I'd need to know more about what you're expecting." "Honestly, I have no idea what I'm expecting." Daniel laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I've been making this up as I go along for 2 years. Leo's therapists say he needs more social interaction, but most kids his age." He trailed off, glancing at his son, who was absorbed in adding details to one of his buildings. "Most kids his age don't understand why he doesn't talk much, or why he needs everything to be arranged just so. And their parents don't want to deal with the complications." "His age group can be tough that way," Sarah agreed. "Emma's struggled with that too. Kids pick up on differences, even when they can't articulate what they're noticing." "Exactly." Daniel looked relieved that she understood. "But maybe with someone like you, someone who gets it, maybe Leo could learn some of those social skills in a safer environment first." The offer was tempting, more than tempting, but Sarah had learned to be cautious about arrangements that seemed too perfect. "What would the schedule look like?" "Flexible. I travel sometimes for work, and I have late meetings fairly regularly. Maybe 15 to 20 hours a week." Tom said Elite could structure it as extended household services, which would mean better pay than standard cleaning rates. 20 hours a week at companion service rates would be enough. Not just enough to keep Emma at her current school, but enough to finally stop choosing between groceries and the electric bill. "I'd need to meet with Tom to discuss the details," Sarah said slowly. "Of course, but—" Daniel hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. "This isn't just about convenience for me, Sarah. Leo's been different since Tuesday. Happier, more willing to try new things. I haven't seen him this engaged with anyone since his mother died." The raw honesty in his voice caught Sarah off guard. For a moment, the careful walls between employer and employee fell away, and she saw Daniel not as the intimidating CEO in the expensive apartment, but as a father desperately trying to help his child navigate a world that often felt hostile to difference. "Dad," Leo called out from where he was arranging tiny Lego people around his village, "can Sarah come back tomorrow? I want to show her the spaceship set Grandma sent for my birthday." Daniel looked at Sarah with raised eyebrows, a question in his expression. "I can move some things around," she said, though she had no idea how she'd manage it. Maybe come by in the afternoon. Leo's whoop of delight made both adults smile. But as Sarah gathered her supplies and prepared to leave, she caught Daniel watching her with that same intense expression she'd noticed on her first day. There was something else there now, though, a guardedness that hadn't been there during their conversation about Leo. "Sarah," he said as she reached the door, "this arrangement, it would be strictly professional. I hope that's clear." The words stung more than they should have. Sarah nodded, forcing her voice to stay level. "Of course, Mr. Morrison, I understand completely." But as the elevator descended toward the lobby, Sarah found herself thinking about the moment during their Lego building when Daniel had smiled, really smiled, unguarded and genuine. For just a few minutes, she'd forgotten about the impossible gulf between their worlds and seen only a man who loved his son fiercely and was trying his best in circumstances that would challenge anyone. The elevator doors opened to reveal Tom Hayes waiting in the marble lobby, his expensive suit and practiced smile marking him as distinctly out of place among the cleaning supplies and service uniforms that were Sarah's usual world. But his presence there, at exactly the moment she was thinking about new arrangements and better pay, felt less like coincidence and more like the first note of a song she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the rest of. "Sarah," Tom said smoothly, approaching with his hand extended. "Mr. Morrison called about expanding your services. I think we need to talk." 2 weeks into the new arrangement, Sarah found herself looking forward to the Morrison penthouse in a way that had nothing to do with the substantially larger paycheck. Leo had begun greeting her at the door with whatever Lego creation he'd been working on, chattering excitedly about his progress, and asking detailed questions about Emma that showed he'd been thinking about their conversations long after she'd left. The change in him was remarkable. Where once he'd been a silent, solitary child, Leo now filled their afternoons with observations about everything from the way shadows moved across his bedroom floor to the precise number of windows visible from the living room. His vocabulary was extensive and sophisticated, as if he'd been storing up words for years and had finally found someone safe enough to share them with. But it was the change in Daniel that caught Sarah off guard. "He's been talking about you at breakfast," Daniel said one Thursday afternoon, leaning against the kitchen counter while Sarah and Leo worked on an elaborate space station in the living room. "Yesterday he asked if you could come to his birthday party next month." Sarah looked up from where she was helping Leo sort pieces by color. "His birthday party? It's usually just family. My parents, my sister's kids when they're in town." Daniel's tone was carefully neutral, but Sarah caught the hesitation underneath. "Leo's never asked to invite anyone before." "That's sweet of him, but I'm sure you'd rather keep it family only." "Actually," Daniel said, moving closer to where they sat, "I was hoping you'd consider it. Leo's been so much more social lately, and if you were there—" He trailed off, running a hand through his hair in a gesture Sarah had learned meant he was working up to something difficult. He might actually enjoy having a party for once. The invitation surprised her. Over the past 2 weeks, Daniel had maintained careful boundaries around their professional relationship, always polite, always grateful for her work with Leo, but never crossing the line into anything that might be considered personal. Yet there had been moments, small ones, when Sarah caught him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, or when their conversations about Leo drifted into discussions about parenting that felt more intimate than either of them seemed comfortable with. "I'd like that," Sarah said, meaning it. "Should I bring Emma? Leo's been asking to meet her." Something flickered across Daniel's face, surprise maybe or concern. "Of course, I'd love to meet her." "Dad, look," Leo interrupted, holding up a complex piece of space station architecture that he'd somehow managed to make both functional and aesthetically pleasing. "The docking bay opens and closes, and there's a place for the astronauts to live inside." "That's incredible, buddy." Daniel knelt down beside them, examining Leo's work with genuine admiration. How did you figure out how to make the door mechanism work? Sarah showed me about hinges last week. If you put the pieces together the right way, they can move but still stay connected. Leah demonstrated the opening and closing door with obvious pride. It's like our bridge, but instead of staying still, it changes. Sarah felt a warm flush of satisfaction watching Leo explain his construction techniques. The boy had a natural engineering mind, and seeing his confidence grow over the past weeks had been one of the most rewarding experiences of her working life. Speaking of bridges, Daniel said, settling more comfortably on the floor, I had an interesting call from Leo's school today. Sarah's hand stilled on the Lego pieces she'd been sorting. Oh. His teacher said he's been much more participative in class. Apparently, he gave a presentation about architectural engineering yesterday, completely unprompted, and explained to his classmates how different types of bridges work. That's wonderful, Sarah said, though she noticed Daniel's tone suggested there was more to the story. It is wonderful. It's also the first time Leo spoken voluntarily in class since he started school. Daniel's voice carried a note of amazement. Mrs. Patterson said she's never seen such a transformation in a student. Leo beamed at the praise, but Sarah felt a familiar twist of anxiety. In her experience, when things were going too well, it usually meant someone was about to pull the rug out from under her. She also mentioned that Leo's been talking about his friend Sarah quite a lot. Apparently the other kids have been asking questions. What kind of questions? Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew. The usual 5-year-old questions. Why does Leo get to have a friend come to his house? Is Sarah his babysitter? Why doesn't she look like the other nannies? The last question hit Sarah with unexpected force. She'd gotten used to being invisible in the world of elite home services, just another uniformed worker who cleaned and organized and disappeared. But Leo's enthusiastic descriptions of their time together had apparently made her more visible than was comfortable. I hope that's not a problem, she said carefully. For me, no. Daniel's response was immediate and firm, but it got me thinking about boundaries and what this arrangement looks like from the outside. Before Sarah could ask what he meant, Leo jumped up from his building project with the sudden energy that characterized all his movements. Can we go to the park today? He asked, bouncing slightly on his toes. I want to see if the real bridges look like the ones we've been building. Sarah glanced at Daniel, unsure. Their time together had been confined to the penthouse, and she wasn't certain how he felt about taking Leo out in public. That's actually a great idea, Daniel said, though Sarah caught a flicker of something nervousness in his expression. The weather's perfect and Leo could use some fresh air. An hour later, they were walking through Lincoln Park, Leo practically vibrating with excitement as he pointed out every bridge they passed and explained their structural elements to anyone within hearing distance. Sarah found herself relaxing into the afternoon sunshine and Leo's infectious enthusiasm, while Daniel seemed to be making a conscious effort to shed his usual controlled demeanor. He's never been this talkative with strangers, Daniel said quietly as Leo struck up a conversation with an elderly man feeding ducks by the pond. Usually, he hides behind me when people try to talk to him. He's gaining confidence. It's natural that he'd want to share what he's learned. Is it natural, though? Daniel stopped walking, his expression suddenly serious. Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I hope you'll be honest with me. The shift in his tone sent a chill through her despite the warm afternoon. Okay. What you're doing with Leo, this isn't just about the job, is it? The question caught her off guard with its directness. Sarah watched Leo demonstrating proper duck feeding technique to his new elderly friend, her mind racing through possible responses. What do you mean? I mean you care about him, really care about him, not just in a professional capacity. Daniel's gaze was intense, searching. And Leo cares about you. He talks about you constantly. He asks when you're coming back, what you're doing when you're not here. He's forming an attachment. Sarah's stomach clenched. Are you saying that's a problem? I'm saying it's complicated. Daniel ran his hand through his hair again, a gesture she now recognized as his tell for internal conflict. Leo's lost one important woman in his life already. If this arrangement doesn't work out, if you decide to move on to other clients, I wouldn't do that to him. You might not have a choice. Daniel's voice was gentle but firm. This isn't sustainable long-term, Sarah. You're smart, you're talented, you're clearly capable of much more than companion services. Eventually, you'll want something different. A career that challenges you, maybe a relationship, a family of your own. The words hung between them, loaded with implications Sarah wasn't sure she was ready to examine. Was Daniel trying to protect his son, or was there something else behind his concern? Leo, Daniel called out, his voice artificially bright, ready to head home. The walk back to the penthouse was quieter, Leo tired from his social exertions, and Daniel lost in thought. Sarah found herself studying both of them, the father trying so hard to protect his son from further loss, and the child who was finally learning to trust the world again. Back in the apartment, while Leo napped on the couch surrounded by Lego instruction manuals, Sarah and Daniel found themselves in the kitchen sharing coffee and the kind of comfortable silence that felt dangerously intimate. "Can I ask you something personal?" Daniel said suddenly. Sarah tensed. "Sure." "Why do you do this work? The cleaning, the companion services. You're clearly educated, you understand child development, you have insights about Leo that his trained therapists missed. Why aren't you working in education or counseling or something that actually uses your skills?" The question was fair, but answering it would require admitting more about her circumstances than she was comfortable sharing. "Life doesn't always go according to plan," she said carefully. "That's not an answer. It's the answer you get." Sarah set down her coffee cup with more force than necessary. "Not everyone has the luxury of choosing a career based on passion, Daniel. Some of us choose based on what pays the bills and provides health insurance and doesn't require childcare we can't afford." Daniel was quiet for a long moment. "I'm sorry, that was presumptuous of me." Yes, it was. But Sarah's anger was already fading, replaced by exhaustion. "Look, I know this arrangement is temporary. I know Leo will eventually outgrow needing a companion, and I know you'll probably want someone with actual credentials to help with his development. But right now, today, I'm here. Leo is happy, and maybe that's enough for now. What if it's not temporary?" The question was so quiet Sarah almost missed it. "What?" Daniel looked up from his coffee, his expression more open than she'd ever seen it. "What if I don't want it to be temporary? What if Leo needs you, not just as a companion, but as part of his life?" Before Sarah could process what he was asking, what he might be suggesting, Leo's voice interrupted from the living room. "Sarah, Dad, come see what I built while you were talking." They found Leo wide awake and surrounded by what appeared to be an entire Lego city, complete with multiple bridges connecting different districts. "It's Chicago," Leo announced proudly. "See, this is where we live," he pointed to a tall tower, "and this is where Sarah lives." He indicated a smaller building across one of his bridges. "And these bridges connect everything so nobody has to be alone." Sarah stared at Leo's creation, her throat suddenly tight. The city was remarkably detailed for something built by a 5-year-old, but it was the thought behind it that took her breath away. Leo had built a world where distance and difference could be overcome by connection, where bridges made it possible for people to reach each other across whatever gaps separated them. "That's beautiful, buddy," Daniel said, his voice rough. "Tell me about these bridges." As Leo launched into an animated explanation of his architectural choices, Sarah caught Daniel's eye across the coffee table. The look that passed between them was loaded with unspoken questions and possibilities that neither of them seemed ready to name. But later, as Sarah packed up her things and prepared to leave, she found Daniel waiting by the door with an expression she couldn't read. "Sarah," he said quietly, glancing toward the living room where Leo was carefully disassembling his city to store the pieces properly. "About what I said earlier, about this not being sustainable." "You're right," she said quickly. "This is temporary, we both know that. But what if I don't want it to be?" The question hung in the air between them, vulnerable and dangerous. "What if I want to find a way to make it work?" Before Sarah could answer, her phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at it automatically, then felt the blood drain from her face. The message was from Tom Hayes. "Need to discuss the Morrison account. Some concerns have been raised. Call me tonight." "Everything okay?" Daniel asked, nodding her expression. "Fine," Sarah managed, though her hands had started shaking. "Just work stuff." But as the elevator descended toward the lobby, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching them in the park today, taking note of how Leo ran to her, how Daniel looked at her when he thought no one was paying attention, how much like a family they'd appeared to anyone observing from a distance. The feeling followed her all the way home, a cold certainty that the perfect afternoon they'd shared had been too visible, too real, and too dangerous for someone who was supposed to remain invisible in the lives of people like the Morrisons. Sarah knew something was wrong the moment she stepped off the elevator. The penthouse felt different, charged with the kind of tension that made the air itself seem brittle. Leo wasn't in his usual spot on the living room rug, and his Lego city from the day before had been carefully packed away into storage containers that sat in a neat row by the window. "Leo," she called out, setting down her bag by the door. "He's in his room," Daniel's voice came from the kitchen, flat and cold in a way that made Sarah's stomach clench. "We need to talk." She found Daniel standing by the granite island, still wearing his suit from whatever meeting had occupied his morning. But his usually perfect appearance showed signs of strain, his tie loosened, his hair disheveled, his face carrying the kind of exhaustion that went deeper than simple tiredness. "Is Leo okay?" Sarah asked, her mind immediately jumping to worst-case scenarios. "Leo's fine, physically." Daniel's emphasis on the last word sent a chill through her. "Sit down, Sarah." She remained standing, every instinct telling her to be ready to run. "What's going on?" Daniel pulled out his phone and set it on the counter between them, the screen displaying what looked like a series of photographs. Sarah's heart stopped as she recognized the images, herself and Daniel and Leo in Lincoln Park the day before, walking together, laughing together, looking for all the world like a family, enjoying an afternoon outing. "Where did you get those?" she whispered. "They were emailed to the board of directors this morning," Daniel said, his voice carrying the kind of controlled fury that was somehow worse than shouting, "along with a very detailed report about my inappropriate relationship with the hired help." Sarah sank into one of the kitchen chairs, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. "Daniel, I can explain." "Explain what, exactly?" He picked up the phone, scrolling through more images. "Explain how you've been using my son to get closer to me. Explain how you've been playing the part of the devoted caregiver while positioning yourself to become the next Mrs. Morrison." The accusation hit Sarah like a physical blow. "That's not. I would never." "Wouldn't you?" Daniel's laugh was bitter and harsh. "Come on, Sarah. Did you really think I wouldn't figure it out eventually? The perfect timing of your appearance in our lives, right when Leo needed someone most. The way you seemed to understand exactly what he needed, exactly what I needed to hear." "You're being ridiculous." Sarah stood up, anger finally overriding shock. "Everything I've done with Leo has been genuine, you know that." "Do I?" Daniel moved around the island, and Sarah could see the pain beneath his fury now. "Because I've been doing some research since these photos arrived. Want to know what I found out about your previous employment?" Sarah's mouth went dry. "What are you talking about?" "3 years ago you worked for the Hendersons. Wealthy family, recently divorced father, young children who needed stability. Daniel's voice was clinical now, detached. 6 months into your employment, you were dating the father. Ring any bells? That was completely different. Was it? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like a pattern. You target vulnerable single fathers, use their children as a way in, and then... Stop! The word came out sharper than Sarah intended, cutting through Daniel's accusations. You want to know about the Hendersons? Fine. James Henderson was lonely and desperate, and yes, we dated for a few months. But I ended it when I realized his children were getting too attached because I actually cared about what was best for them. Is that the pattern you're seeing? Daniel's expression faltered slightly, but he pressed on. The point is, you've done this before. You've used your position to... To what? To fall in love. The words were out before Sarah could stop them, hanging in the air between them like a confession she hadn't meant to make. The silence that followed was deafening. Daniel stared at her, his face cycling through surprise, confusion, and something that might have been hope before settling back into careful blankness. That's exactly what I'm talking about, he said finally, but his voice lacked the conviction it had carried moments before. Sarah felt something break inside her chest. You bastard, you actually think I've been manipulating you, manipulating Leo. Haven't you? No. The word came out quiet but firm. I've been doing my job. I've been caring about a little boy who needed someone to see him for who he really is. And I've been trying very hard not to fall in love with his father because I knew this was exactly how it would end. Daniel's mask slipped completely then, revealing the raw hurt underneath. Then why did you? Why did I what? Fall in love with me. His voice was barely above a whisper. If you knew how it would end, why did you let it happen? The question hung between them, vulnerable and desperate, and Sarah felt her own walls crumbling. Because you looked at me like I mattered. Because when Leo smiled at something I'd taught him, you smiled too, like you were proud of both of us. Because for the first time in years, I felt like I was good at something that actually made a difference. Sarah. But you're right about one thing, she continued, her voice growing stronger. This was always going to end badly. I just didn't think you'd make it quite this cruel. She moved toward her bag, intending to leave with whatever dignity she had left. But Daniel stepped into her path, his expression stricken. Don't go, please, let me explain. Explain what? How you've been waiting for me to prove I was just another gold digger. How you never actually trusted me with your son, even though you watched me help him come back to life. That's not. It's more complicated than that. Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in it. It really isn't. Someone took some pictures of us looking happy together, and you immediately assumed the worst about my motives. That tells me everything I need to know about what you really think of me. The board is threatening to remove me as CEO, Daniel said suddenly. They're saying I've become unreliable, that I'm putting personal interests ahead of company welfare. The admission stopped Sarah in her tracks. What? Morrison Tech is in the middle of a major acquisition. The board has been looking for reasons to question my leadership ever since Julia died. These photos. He ran his hands through his hair. They're saying I'm not fit to run the company if I can't maintain appropriate boundaries with employees. Sarah felt a cold understanding settle over her. And losing the company would mean losing your ability to provide for Leo. It would mean losing everything. Daniel's voice was raw with exhaustion. The house, Leo's school, his therapy, his stability, everything I've worked for since Julia died. So you chose the company over me. I chose Leo over everything else. The words came out fierce and desperate. I will always choose Leo. And you think I wouldn't? Sarah's voice rose, all her careful control finally snapping. You think I've spent the last month teaching him to trust people, helping him find his voice, showing him that he's worthy of love and attention. You think I did all of that to hurt him. I think you did it because you're good at it, because you care about him. But I also think you knew it would make me fall in love with you, and that was part of the plan." The accusation was like a slap. Sarah stared at Daniel, seeing not the man who had smiled at her over Lego bridges, but a stranger who had already convicted her in his mind. "Who sent the photos?" she asked quietly. Daniel hesitated. "Does it matter?" "It matters to me. Someone went to a lot of trouble to document our afternoon in the park. Someone who knew exactly which buttons to push with your board of directors. So who was it?" "Victoria Sterling. She's one of our corporate attorneys, and she's been concerned about my judgment lately." Concerned or interested? Sarah saw the truth in Daniel's expression before he could answer. "She wants you for herself." "Victoria's motives aren't the issue here." "Aren't they?" Sarah moved closer, her voice dropping to the tone she used when she was truly angry. "Let me guess. Victoria has been very supportive since Julia died, very understanding about your need to focus on Leo, very patient about waiting for you to be ready for a relationship again." Daniel's silence was answer enough. "And then I came along," Sarah continued. "The hired help who got closer to you and Leo in a month than she'd managed in 2 years. Of course she was concerned." "That doesn't change what you did." "What I did," Sarah's voice rose again. "What I did was love your son. What I did was help him learn to trust people again. What I did was fall in love with a man who apparently thinks so little of me that he believes I'm capable of using a child's trauma for personal gain." The sound of a door opening made them both freeze. Leo appeared in the kitchen doorway, his hair messy from sleep, and his eyes red-rimmed in a way that suggested he'd heard more of their argument than either adult was comfortable with. "Why are you yelling?" he asked, his voice small and confused. "Why is Sarah crying?" Sarah wiped her eyes, not realizing tears had started falling. "I'm sorry, Leo. We didn't mean to wake you up." "Are you leaving?" Leo's question was directed at Sarah, but his eyes kept flicking between her and his father with the kind of awareness that children developed when the adults in their lives were constantly on the verge of falling apart. "Yes," Sarah said gently, "I have to go." "But you'll come back tomorrow, right? We were going to work on the space station." The hope in Leo's voice nearly broke what was left of Sarah's composure. She knelt down to his level, taking his small hands in hers. "I don't think I'll be coming back, sweetheart. But that doesn't mean I don't care about you, okay? You're the smartest, most creative, most wonderful kid I've ever known, and I want you to keep building amazing things." Leo's face crumpled. "But I don't want you to go. I need you to help me with the bridges." "You don't need me for bridges, Leo. You've always been good at building them. I just helped you see that you could." She pulled him into a hug, breathing in his little boy smell and trying to memorize the feeling of his arms around her neck. When she stood up, Daniel was watching them with an expression of such profound regret that it took all her strength not to reach for him too. "Take care of him," she said quietly. "Sarah, wait." But she was already moving toward the door, grabbing her bag and walking away from the life she'd allowed herself to imagine, even for just a moment. The elevator doors closed on the sound of Leo's confused questions and Daniel's attempts to explain why the woman who had helped him find his voice was never coming back. By the time Sarah reached the lobby, the tears were flowing freely. But it wasn't until she stepped out onto Michigan Avenue, into the noise and chaos of Chicago traffic, that she allowed herself to acknowledge the full scope of what she'd lost. Not just a job, not just better pay, but the chance to be part of something beautiful. The chance to help Leo continue growing into the remarkable person he was becoming. The chance to build something real with Daniel, something that could have bridged the gap between their different worlds. She thought of Leo's Lego City from the day before, with its careful bridges connecting different districts, making it possible for everyone to reach each other across whatever separated them. But some gaps, Sarah realized, were too wide to bridge. Some distances were measured not in feet or miles, but in trust and belief and the courage to see past the surface to what was real underneath. And some bridges, no matter how carefully built, were too fragile to survive the weight of other people's fears. 5 days after Sarah walked out of the Morrison penthouse, Daniel found himself staring at his son across the breakfast table, watching Leo push scrambled eggs around his plate without eating a single bite. It was the same scene that had played out every morning since Thursday, Leo silent, withdrawn, and steadily disappearing back into the shell that Sarah had so carefully helped him emerge from. "You need to eat something, buddy," Daniel said gently, though his own coffee had gone cold an hour ago. Leo looked up with eyes that seemed far too old for his 5-year-old face. "Is Sarah sick?" It was the same question Leo had asked every day, and Daniel still didn't have an answer that wouldn't require explaining concepts like adult betrayal and corporate politics to a child who just wanted to know why the person who understood him best had suddenly vanished. "No, Leo, Sarah's not sick." "Then why can't she come back?" Daniel set down his coffee cup, his hands shaking slightly. The board meeting was in 3 hours, the meeting where Victoria Sterling would present her case for his removal as CEO, using Sarah's supposed manipulation as evidence of his compromised judgment. He should be preparing his defense, reviewing financial reports, calling allies. Instead, he was sitting in his pristine kitchen, unable to explain to his son why he destroyed the best thing that had happened to either of them in 2 years. "It's complicated, buddy. You always say that when you don't want to tell me the truth." Leo pushed his plate away, the eggs barely touched. "Did you make Sarah go away like you made Mommy go away?" The question hit Daniel like a physical blow. "Leo, I didn't make Mommy go away. Mommy was sick, remember? Her body stopped working and the doctors couldn't fix it." "But you could fix Sarah coming back. You just don't want to." Leo's voice was matter-of-fact, carrying the brutal honesty that only children possessed. "You're scared." Daniel stared at his son, wondering when Leo had become so perceptive, so capable of seeing through adult justifications to the truth underneath. "What am I scared of?" "That she'll go away like Mommy did, so you made her go away first." Leo climbed down from his chair, his breakfast abandoned. "That's stupid, Dad. Sarah's not sick. She was happy here." As Leo wandered back to his room, to the space where his Lego constructions had remained untouched for 5 days, Daniel felt something crack open in his chest. The careful control he'd maintained since Julia's death, the protective barriers he'd built around his heart and his son's future, suddenly felt less like armor and more like a prison. His phone buzzed with a text from Victoria. "Board meeting moved to 2 p.m. Everything's ready. This will all be over soon." The message should have felt like support. Victoria had been nothing but helpful throughout this crisis, offering legal advice and emotional support while promising to help him navigate the board's concerns. But looking at her words now, Daniel felt a chill of unease. Everything's ready. Ready for what? To destroy Sarah's reputation, to remove him from the company his father had built, to clear the path for Victoria's own ambitions. Daniel pulled up the photos on his phone, the ones Victoria had forwarded from the concerned board member who'd sent them. He'd looked at them dozens of times over the past 5 days, each viewing confirming his worst fears about Sarah's motives. But now, staring at the images of himself and Sarah and Leo in Lincoln Park, he saw something different. He saw a family. Not a manipulative woman positioning herself for financial gain, but 3 people who had found something precious in each other's company. He saw Sarah's genuine laughter as Leo explained bridge engineering to passing joggers. He saw his own unguarded smile, the first real smile he'd worn since Julia's funeral. He saw Leo running ahead of them, confident and happy, calling back to make sure they were following. Most importantly, he saw the way Sarah looked at Leo, not with calculation or artifice, but with the fierce protective love of someone who would do anything to keep that child safe and happy. The same way she'd looked at him when she'd asked him not to give up on Leo's progress. Daniel's phone rang, interrupting his revelation. Tom Hayes from Elite Home Services. Mr. Morrison, Tom's voice was smooth and professional. I wanted to follow up on the situation with Sarah Martinez. I trust everything has been resolved to your satisfaction. Something in Tom's tone set Daniel's teeth on edge. What do you mean, resolved? Well, the termination of services, of course. Ms. Sterling called yesterday to confirm that Ms. Martinez would no longer be needed and to discuss transitioning to a more suitable arrangement. Victoria called you. Yes, she mentioned that you'd prefer someone with more traditional nanny credentials, someone who understands appropriate boundaries with high-profile clients. Tom's pause was calculated. Between you and me, Mr. Morrison, Sarah was always a bit too ambitious for domestic services. I wasn't surprised when this situation developed. Daniel's grip tightened on the phone. What situation exactly? Oh, you know how it is with these girls. They see a wealthy widower and start getting ideas above their station. Sarah's done it before, actually. The Henderson account a few years ago. Similar circumstances, similar problems. What kind of problems? Getting too involved with the family, crossing professional boundaries, making the children too dependent on her. James Henderson had to let her go when his kids started calling her mom. Tom's laugh was ugly. Some women just can't resist playing the rescuer, especially when there's money involved. Daniel ended the call without responding, his mind racing. Tom's version of events didn't match what Sarah had told him about the Henderson family. She'd said she ended the relationship because the children were getting too attached. She'd said she cared about what was best for them. What if she'd been telling the truth? Daniel scrolled through his contacts until he found James Henderson's number. They'd met at various Chicago business functions over the years. Henderson ran a successful architectural firm, and their companies had collaborated on several projects. If anyone could tell him the truth about Sarah's time with his family, it would be James. The call was answered on the second ring. James, it's Daniel Morrison. I hope you don't mind me calling, but I need to ask you about someone who used to work for your family. Sarah Martinez. Sarah, James's voice warmed immediately. God, that woman was a lifesaver. My kids still ask about her sometimes. Why? She's been working for us, was working for us. There's been some confusion about her previous employment. What kind of confusion? Daniel chose his words carefully. Someone suggested that she'd been inappropriate with your family, that she'd crossed professional boundaries. The silence that followed was so long that Daniel wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, James spoke, his voice tight with anger. Who told you that bullshit? It doesn't matter. I just need to know what really happened. What happened was that Sarah saved my family. James's words came out in a rush. After Lisa died, my kids were falling apart. Sophie wouldn't talk to anyone, and Michael was having nightmares every night. Sarah didn't just clean my house or watch my kids, she helped them process their grief. She taught Sophie how to express her feelings through art projects, got Michael interested in building models that helped him work through his anxiety. And the romantic relationship. James's laugh was rueful. Yeah, we dated for a few months. I was lonely, she was kind, and we both cared about my kids. But you know who ended it? Sarah did. She said the kids were starting to see her as a replacement for their mother, and that wasn't fair to any of us. Daniel felt something cold settle in his stomach. She ended it. She walked away from the easiest life she could have had because she thought it was better for my children. Do you have any idea how rare that kind of integrity is? James paused. Daniel, if someone's telling you Sarah Martinez is a gold digger, they're either lying or they've got their own agenda. That woman is gold, but not the kind people dig for. After ending the call, Daniel sat in his kitchen staring at his phone, pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. Victoria's immediate interest in the Morrison situation. Tom Hayes's eagerness to provide a replacement nanny. The convenient timing of the photographs. taken by someone who knew exactly where they'd be and when. Sarah hadn't been manipulating him. She'd been loving him, loving Leo, with the same integrity that had led her to walk away from the Henderson family when staying would have been easier. And he'd thrown it all away because he was too scared to trust in something good. Daniel's phone buzzed with another text from Victoria. "Don't worry about the board meeting. I've got everything handled. You won't have to see her again." The phrasing sent a chill through him. You won't have to see her again. Not she won't bother you again, or the situation is resolved. As if Victoria had taken steps to ensure Sarah would be removed from his life permanently. Daniel grabbed his keys and headed for the elevator, already pulling up Sarah's address on his phone. Mrs. Rodriguez had mentioned that Sarah lived in Logan Square, and Elite Home Services would have her employment records on file. But as the elevator descended toward the garage, Daniel realized he might already be too late. If Victoria had been orchestrating this entire situation, if she'd convinced the board that Sarah was a threat to Daniel's judgment and the company's stability, then Sarah wasn't just unemployed, she was unemployable. No reputable domestic service agency would hire someone who'd been accused of manipulating wealthy clients. Victoria had effectively destroyed Sarah's career and her ability to support her daughter. The drive to Logan Square took 25 minutes through Chicago's afternoon traffic, every red light and congested intersection, increasing Daniel's sense of urgency. He'd been so focused on protecting Leo from potential hurt that he'd failed to protect the woman who'd brought his son back to life. Sarah's building was a modest 3-story walk-up with a small garden in front and children's toys scattered on the front steps. Daniel climbed to the second floor, his heart pounding as he knocked on apartment 2B. Mrs. Rodriguez answered the door, her weathered face creasing into a frown when she saw him. "You," she said, her voice carrying decades of disappointment with wealthy men who made promises they didn't keep. "Is Sarah here? I need to talk to her." "Sarah's not here for you to talk to." Mrs. Rodriguez stepped into the hallway, pulling the door partially closed behind her. "That girl's been crying for 5 days. Emma keeps asking why Mama's so sad, and Sarah can't tell her it's because some rich man decided she wasn't good enough for his world." "That's not, I made a mistake, a terrible mistake. I need to apologize to explain." "Explain what?" "That you believed lies about her. That you threw away the best thing that ever happened to your boy because someone told you she wasn't worthy." Mrs. Rodriguez's eyes flashed with protective anger. "Sarah's gone, Mr. Morrison. She took Emma and left this morning." Daniel felt the world tilt around him. "Gone where?" "Somewhere she can start over without people like you making her feel small." Mrs. Rodriguez studied his face, seeing something there that made her expression soften slightly. "She left you something, though. Said if you ever came looking, you should have it." She disappeared into the apartment, returning with a small manila envelope that had his name written on it in Sarah's careful handwriting. Inside was a single red Lego brick, the same one Sarah had left for Leo on her first day, along with a brief note. "Daniel, this belongs to Leo. It's the piece that connects everything else together, the one that makes the whole structure stable. I hope someday he understands that he doesn't need anyone else to make him complete. He's always had everything he needs inside himself. Tell him his bridges were perfect. S." Daniel stared at the tiny red brick, remembering the day Sarah had found it for Leo, the way his son's face had lit up when the missing piece made his castle whole. Now he understood what she'd been trying to tell him all along. Leo didn't need to be fixed or saved or protected from the world. He needed to be seen, understood, and given the confidence to build his own bridges. The same way Sarah had seen and understood Daniel himself, looking past his wealth and his defenses to the frightened father underneath, who just wanted to keep his son safe. "Do you know where she went?" Daniel asked, though he already suspected the answer. Mrs. Rodriguez shook her head. "Somewhere far from Chicago, somewhere far from you." As Daniel drove back toward downtown, the red Lego brick clutched in his palm, he realized that Sarah had given him more than just a token for Leo. She'd given him a choice. He could let fear continue to dictate his decisions, could accept Victoria's version of events and the safe, controlled life she offered, or he could find the courage to build bridges of his own, to reach across the damage he'd caused and fight for the woman who'd taught his son to trust in connection again. The board meeting was in an hour. Victoria would be expecting him to play the role of the grateful CEO, accepting her help in removing the unsuitable influence from his life. She'd be counting on his fear of losing control, his terror of risking Leo's stability for something as unreliable as love. But as Daniel pulled into the parking garage beneath Morrison Tech's downtown headquarters, he found himself thinking not about corporate politics or boardroom strategies, but about a 5-year-old boy who'd built an entire city out of Lego bricks, connected by bridges that made it possible for everyone to reach each other across whatever separated them. Some distances were too wide to bridge, but others, the ones that really mattered, required nothing more than the courage to take the first step across the gap, trusting that the person on the other side would meet you halfway. Daniel took the elevator to the 40th floor, the red Lego brick warm in his palm, and prepared to build the most important bridge of his life. The Morrison Tech boardroom had never felt smaller. Daniel sat at the head of the polished mahogany table, watching Victoria Sterling arrange her presentation materials with the satisfied air of someone who had already won. The other board members, his father's old friends, business partners who had watched Daniel grow up, avoided his eyes as they shuffled through the damning photographs and carefully worded reports that painted him as a CEO compromised by personal entanglements. "As you can see," Victoria was saying, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to winning arguments, "Mr. Morrison's judgment has become increasingly questionable since he began his association with this domestic service employee. The photographs clearly show an inappropriate relationship that compromises his position as the face of this company." Daniel fingered the red Lego brick in his pocket, Sarah's note echoing in his mind. The piece that connects everything else together, the one that makes the whole structure stable. "Furthermore," Victoria continued, "I've spoken with Elite Home Services, and they confirm that Ms. Martinez has a pattern of targeting vulnerable single fathers. The Henderson situation 3 years ago shows a clear history of manipulation and boundary violations." "That's interesting," Daniel said quietly, his voice cutting through Victoria's presentation, "because I spoke with James Henderson this morning." Victoria's polished composure faltered slightly. "I'm sorry." "James Henderson. You remember him, Henderson Architectural. They've done work for us. I called him to ask about Sarah Martinez's time with his family." The boardroom fell silent. Victoria's hand tightened imperceptibly on her presentation remote. "What James told me was very different from what you've presented here," Daniel continued, standing up and walking to the wall of windows that overlooked downtown Chicago. "He told me that Sarah ended their relationship because she was concerned about the children's emotional well-being. He told me that she walked away from financial security because she thought it was the right thing to do for his family." "Daniel," Victoria said, her voice carrying a warning note, "I don't think personal testimonials are relevant to." "He also told me something interesting about how news of their relationship became public." Daniel turned back to face the room, his eyes fixed on Victoria. "Apparently, someone anonymously tipped off the board of his architectural firm, someone who had detailed information about his personal life, including photos of him and Sarah with his children." Victoria's face had gone pale, but she maintained her composure. "I fail to see how this relates to your current situation." "Don't you?" Daniel pulled out his phone, scrolling to a number he'd called on his way to the meeting. "Because I also spoke with Marcus Chen at Chicago Tribune's business section. Funny thing, he got an anonymous tip yesterday about a Morrison Tech CEO's inappropriate relationship with household staff, complete with photographs and detailed background information. The silence in the boardroom was deafening. Daniel could see realization dawning on the faces of several board members. "Victoria," said Robert Morrison, Daniel's uncle and the longest-serving board member, "perhaps you'd like to explain how a business reporter got information about a private company matter before it was discussed in this boardroom." "I have no idea what Daniel is implying." "I'm not implying anything," Daniel said, his voice steady and clear. "I'm stating facts. Someone orchestrated this entire situation. Someone took those photographs, distributed them to damage both my reputation and Sarah's livelihood, and then positioned themselves as the solution to the crisis they created." Victoria's mask finally slipped completely. "You're being paranoid, Daniel. The stress of single parenthood has clearly—" "The stress of single parenthood." Daniel's voice rose for the first time. "Let me tell you about the stress of single parenthood, Victoria. It's watching your 5-year-old son withdraw from the world because he's lost the most important person in his life. It's lying awake at night wondering if you're failing him, if you're so focused on protecting him that you're actually hurting him. It's being afraid to trust anyone because the people you love have a habit of disappearing." He looked around the room at faces that had known him since childhood, people who had watched him build this company from his father's small software firm into an industry leader. "But here's what I learned from Sarah Martinez," Daniel continued. "I learned that love isn't about control. It's about trust. It's about seeing the best in people instead of looking for reasons to push them away. And it's about having the courage to build bridges instead of walls." Daniel pulled the red Lego brick from his pocket, setting it on the polished table in front of him. "My son built an entire city out of these pieces, bridges connecting different areas, making it possible for everyone to reach each other. He did that because a woman named Sarah Martinez taught him that connection was possible, that differences didn't have to mean isolation." Robert Morrison leaned forward, studying the tiny plastic brick. "Daniel, what are you asking us to do here?" "I'm asking you to trust me, the way I should have trusted Sarah." Daniel's voice was quiet but firm. "I'm asking you to understand that the best decision I've made as CEO wasn't about market share or profit margins. It was falling in love with a woman who saw my son for who he really is and helped him see his own worth." "And if we can't do that?" Victoria asked, her voice sharp with anger. "Then you'll have my resignation," Daniel said simply. "But you'll also lose the best thing that ever happened to this company, the understanding that business success means nothing if we lose our humanity in the process." The vote was closer than Daniel had hoped but wider than he'd expected. 7-3, with Victoria and 2 of her allies dissenting. As the other board members filed out, making awkward small talk about quarterly projections and market volatility, Robert Morrison lingered. "Your father would be proud," the older man said quietly. "Not of the business decisions, though those have been excellent, but of the man you've become. Julia would be proud too." "I hope so," Daniel said, pocketing the red Lego brick. "But now I have to figure out how to find Sarah and convince her to give me another chance." "Start with the daughter," Robert suggested. "In my experience, if you want to reach the mother, you go through the child. Where would an 8-year-old girl with Down syndrome need to go to school?" Daniel stared at his uncle, pieces clicking into place. "Specialized programs. Not many cities have them and they're expensive. So look for cities with excellent special needs education programs, and see if any have had recent enrollment from Chicago transfers." 3 hours later, Daniel had narrowed his search to 4 cities: Denver, Portland, Boston, and surprisingly, Nashville. All had renowned programs for children with intellectual disabilities, and all were far enough from Chicago to represent a fresh start for someone trying to escape their past. But it was Leo who provided the final clue. "Sarah said Emma likes music," Leo said that evening as they sat together in his room, surrounded by the Lego constructions that had remained untouched since Sarah's departure. She said Emma can play songs on the piano just by hearing them once. Nashville, the city of music, with the Monroe Carroll Jr. Children's Hospital's renowned developmental programs and the Blair School of Music's special education initiatives. Daniel called in every favor he had, contacted every connection in Nashville's business and education communities, and finally found what he was looking for. Emma Martinez, recently enrolled at the Martha O'Brien Center's Inclusive Education Program. The flight to Nashville took 2 hours. The drive to the small apartment complex where Sarah and Emma were staying took another 30 minutes. The courage to knock on the door took everything Daniel had left. Sarah answered on the third knock, her face cycling through surprise, anger, and something that might have been hope before settling into careful neutrality. "How did you find us?" Leo, he remembered that Emma loves music. Daniel held up the red Lego brick. "You forgot something." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't step aside to let him in. "That's not mine." "No, it's Leo's, but he wanted me to bring it to you. He said it doesn't work without you." From somewhere inside the apartment came the sound of piano music, simple, sweet, and hauntingly beautiful. "That's Emma," Sarah said, her voice soft. "She's been playing since we got here. I think music helps her process changes." "Sarah," Daniel said, his voice breaking slightly, "I was wrong. About everything. Victoria orchestrated the whole thing, the photos, the board pressure, all of it. She destroyed your reputation to get to me." "I know," Sarah said quietly. "You know." Mrs. Rodriguez called this morning. "Apparently Victoria showed up at Elite Home Services yesterday, making sure I couldn't get any references for future employment." Sarah's laugh was bitter but not surprised. "I should have seen it coming. Beautiful, successful women don't usually pay that much attention to the hired help unless there's a reason." "I'm sorry," Daniel said, and the words felt completely inadequate. "I'm so sorry, Sarah. I let fear make my decisions, and I hurt you and Leo in the process." Sarah was quiet for so long that Daniel wondered if she was going to close the door in his face. Finally, she stepped aside. "Emma," she called out, "we have a visitor." The little girl who appeared in the doorway had her mother's warm brown eyes and a smile that lit up her entire face when she saw Daniel. "Are you Leo's daddy?" Emma asked, bouncing slightly on her toes in a gesture that reminded Daniel powerfully of his son. "Yes, I am. Leo's been asking about you." "Is he here?" Emma looked past Daniel hopefully. "He's back in Chicago, but he really wants to meet you." Daniel knelt down to Emma's level. "He's been building amazing things with his Legos, and I think he'd love to show you." Emma clapped her hands together in delight. "Can we go see him, please, Mama?" Sarah's expression was carefully guarded. "Emma, sweetheart, why don't you go back to your piano practice? Mr. Morrison and I need to talk." As Emma skipped back to her keyboard, Sarah led Daniel to the small living room. The apartment was nothing like the penthouse they'd left behind, tiny, furnished with second-hand furniture, and filled with the kind of creative chaos that came from a mother and daughter making a new home together. "She's been asking about Leo constantly," Sarah said, settling into a worn armchair. "I didn't realize how much she'd been looking forward to meeting him." "He's been asking about both of you. He hasn't touched his Legos since you left. He just sits in his room, staring at the space where his city used to be." Sarah's facade cracked slightly. "How is he?" "Heartbroken like his father." Daniel sat on the edge of the couch, the red Lego brick balanced on his palm. "Sarah, I know I don't deserve another chance. I know I hurt you in ways that might not be fixable, but Leo needs you, not just as someone who understands his differences, but as someone who sees his strengths." "And what about you, Daniel? What do you need?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with months of unspoken feelings and fears. "I need you," Daniel said simply. "Not because you're good for Leo, Not because you make my life easier, but because you make me want to be the kind of man who deserves you. You make me want to build bridges instead of walls." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, studying the red brick in Daniel's hand. "That piece," she said finally, "it's not actually from any specific set. I found it in Leo's room the first day I worked for you, just lying on the floor. I almost threw it away because I thought it was broken or leftover from something else." "But you didn't." "No, because even though it didn't seem to belong anywhere, I could see that it was important. It was small and seemed insignificant, but it was exactly the right size and shape to fill the gaps in other constructions." Sarah met his eyes. "I realized later that the most important pieces are often the ones that don't look like they belong at first." "Sarah," Daniel said, his voice rough with emotion, "come home, please. Let me show you that you belong with us, that you've always belonged with us." "It's not that simple, Daniel. I can't just—" The sound of piano music stopped abruptly, followed by Emma's excited voice calling from the other room. "Mama, Mama, come look. I figured out how to play that song Leo likes." Sarah and Daniel both went to see what Emma had discovered. She was sitting at her small keyboard, her fingers moving over the keys as she played a simple but recognizable melody, the theme song from Leo's favorite cartoon. "How do you know that song?" Sarah asked, amazed. "Leo's daddy hummed it," Emma said matter-of-factly, "when he was talking about Leo being sad, so I learned it in case Leo wants to hear it when we go visit him." Sarah looked at Daniel with surprise. "You hummed Leo's favorite song while we were talking." "I guess I did," Daniel said, realizing it was true. "I do that when I'm thinking about him, when I'm worried." Emma beamed at both adults. "Music helps people feel better when they're sad. Maybe Leo will feel better if he knows I learned his song." Sarah sat down next to her daughter, her defenses finally crumbling. "Emma, sweetie, how would you feel about going back to Chicago, just for a visit? To meet Leo and see his Legos?" Emma's excitement was infectious. "Can we go today?" "Not today," Sarah said, laughing despite herself. "But maybe soon." She looked up at Daniel, her expression still cautious but no longer closed off entirely. "I'm not saying yes," she said carefully. "I'm saying maybe. Maybe we can figure out how to build a bridge that's strong enough to support all of us." "That's all I'm asking for," Daniel said, holding out the red Lego brick. "A chance to build something together." Sarah took the tiny piece, turning it over in her palm. "Leo was right, you know. This really is the piece that holds everything together." 3 weeks later, Daniel stood in his living room watching Leo and Emma work together on the most ambitious Lego construction either of them had ever attempted. It was a sprawling metropolis with multiple districts connected by an intricate network of bridges, each span designed to accommodate different types of residents and travelers. "See," Leo was explaining to Emma with the serious intensity he brought to all his building projects. "This bridge is for regular people, but this one has special ramps for people who need wheelchairs or if they can't walk very far." "That's smart," Emma said admiringly. "Everyone should be able to cross bridges." Sarah looked up from where she was sorting Lego pieces by color, a task that had somehow become a meditative ritual for all of them. "That's a very wise observation, Emma." "Sarah taught me that," Leo said matter-of-factly. "She said bridges aren't about keeping people apart, they're about helping people reach each other." Daniel felt his heart clench with love and gratitude as he watched his son, confident, articulate, building elaborate structures that celebrated connection rather than isolation. The change in Leo over the past month had been remarkable, but it wasn't just about Sarah's return. It was about the security that came from knowing the people he loved weren't going anywhere. "Dad," Leo called out, "can you help us with this tower? We need someone with long arms." As Daniel knelt down to join the construction project, Sarah caught his eye and smiled, the kind of smile that carried promises of tomorrow and the day after that. The red Lego brick sat in the center of their creation, exactly where Leo had placed it weeks ago. Not the most visible piece, not the largest or most colorful, but the one that connected the eastern and western districts, making it possible for residents of both sides to reach each other across the river that ran through the middle of their imaginary city. Later that evening, after Emma had fallen asleep in the guest room that Sarah was slowly making their own, and after Leo had completed his elaborate bedtime ritual of storing his Legos in precise organizational systems, Daniel found Sarah on the penthouse balcony, looking out over the lights of real Chicago. "Regrets?" he asked, slipping his arms around her from behind. "About coming back? No." Sarah leaned into his embrace. "About the time we lost? Maybe. But Emma says you can't build new things if you spend too much time wishing the old pieces were different." "Emma's pretty wise." "She gets that from her father," Sarah said, then paused. "Her biological father wasn't a bad person, Daniel. He was just scared. Fear makes people do cruel things sometimes. Like accusing the woman you love of being a gold digger." "Like that?" Sarah turned in his arms, her expression serious. "But fear also makes people careful, and careful isn't always wrong, especially when there's a child involved." Daniel cupped her face in his hands, marveling at how perfectly she fit against him. "I love you, Sarah Martinez. Not carefully, not reasonably, but completely. The way Leo loves building bridges, the way Emma loves making music, the way bridges and music both make it possible to reach across distances and create something beautiful." "I love you too," Sarah said, her voice soft but certain. "And I love Leo, and I love the life we're building together, one small piece at a time." The kiss that followed was sweet and slow, full of promises and possibilities. And if anyone had been watching from the Chicago River or the surrounding buildings, they would have seen exactly what Daniel's board of directors had eventually come to understand. Not a CEO compromised by personal entanglements, but a man who had learned that the strongest foundations were built not from steel and concrete, but from trust and love and the courage to keep building bridges even when you're afraid they might not hold. 6 months later, on a perfect Chicago spring morning in Lincoln Park, Daniel Morrison and Sarah Martinez were married in a small ceremony attended by family, friends, and one very excited 5-year-old ring bearer who had spent weeks planning the Lego architecture for the reception centerpieces. Emma played Pachelbel's canon on a portable keyboard, and Leo's toast, delivered with the serious intensity he brought to all important occasions, was about how bridges make it possible for people to become family even when they start out as strangers. The red Lego brick was incorporated into Sarah's bouquet, a tiny splash of color among the white roses and baby's breath, small enough that only people who knew its significance would understand why it was there. As Daniel and Sarah danced their first dance as husband and wife, Leo and Emma raced around the edges of the reception area, building impromptu Lego sculptures for the guests, and explaining to anyone who would listen that the secret to strong construction was always the same. Find the pieces that fit together, connect them carefully, and never be afraid to build something bigger than what you originally planned. And in the centerpiece of the main table, surrounded by white flowers and twinkling lights, a small red Lego brick caught the afternoon sunlight and threw tiny rainbows across the faces of 3 people who had learned that the most important bridges are built not over rivers or valleys, but across the spaces between human hearts, one small, careful, courageous connection at a time.